Hello everyone. In the previous lecture, we talked about the caste system. The Indian caste system, as detailed in early Brahmanical texts like the Vedas, establishes a hierarchical structure comprising of four primary groups known as Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas and Shudras. The Brahmins occupy the top tier of this social ladder, serving as priests and teachers who have traditionally held significant influence over religious and educational spheres. The Kshatriyas, positioned just below the Brahmins, were warriors and rulers tasked with governance. They are also military leaders who upheld justice. Below them were the Vaishyas, who formed the community of cultivators, traders, herders, playing crucial role in the economy through agriculture and trade. Now at the bottom of these fourfold Varna system were the Shudras, who served the upper three castes and were denied privileges like education and religious rituals. Now, as we spoke in the previous lecture, beyond these four Varnas, a separate group known as the untouchables or Chandalas emerged. And these were the groups that were likely added at a later period. These individuals performed tasks that were deemed impure, such as handling corpses, and faced severe discrimination. They were forced to live outside the boundaries of villages, isolated from mainstream society, and so on. The caste-based identity, also known as Jati, functioned not only as a birth-based social order, but also as a profession, intertwining one's social status with their occupation. A core aspect of this system was endogamy, the practice of marrying within one's caste to maintain the purity of the upper castes and prevent pollution from the lower castes and untouchables. Over time, this rigid and exclusionary structure reinforced the dominance of the upper castes, thereby marginalizing the lower caste people and perpetuating social inequalities for centuries to come. The dynamics of centrality and marginalization inherent in caste system left a lasting impact on Indian society, influencing cultural norms, social interactions and access to resources. In this lecture, we will learn about the anti-caste movements that ran parallel to the nationalist movements. An inquiry into Dalit historiography or the writing of Dalit lives raises several key questions. What kind of history is written and narrated in Dalit politics? Who and what issues come to the focus in Dalit history? And what are its implications? Now, history related to caste and anti-caste movements have been written in three ways. First, theorizing caste, which explores different meanings, facets and origin of caste. Second, documenting anti-caste movements, either through chronological accounts or regional studies. And finally, focusing on the lives of 19th century anti-caste leaders and their contribution in anti-caste movements. Now, since our focus is on knowledge production or produced by Dalit politics, in this lecture I will primarily examine how Dalit and anti-caste politics are historicized rather than how caste itself is theorized. This approach, you have to remember, does not diminish the significance of empirical studies on caste. It, however, emphasizes the counter ideology created by anti-caste politics, which is central to contemporary Dalit theorization. In popular understanding, Dalit politics is often perceived as a counter-hegemonic movement that arose during nationalist struggle, primarily in opposition to the dominance of Brahmanical ideology. This interpretation positions Dalit politics not only as a quest for social and political rights, but also as a challenge to the exclusionary nature of mainstream nationalist movements. Nationalism, often shaped by upper caste perspectives, failed to adequately address the deep-seated issues of caste discrimination and the marginalization of Dalits. In such context, Dalit politics therefore seeks to reinforce and reclaim historical agency, critique caste-based oppression, and assert an identity that is distinct from dominant nationalist narrative. In the previous lecture, we have spoken about how these anti-caste movements fractured the very notion of nation. And this fracturing from within is one of the major components that constitute Dalit understanding as well as anti-caste movements. This idea resonates with the field of subaltern studies in India, which aims to reinterpret history from the perspective of marginalized communities, creating an alternative to mainstream historical accounts. Now, at this point, I would also like to mention that when it comes to the interaction between Dalit politics and theorization and subaltern historiography, there are a lot of debates. However, for this class, it is also important to know what subaltern historiography is, because at least in their tenor, both Dalit approach and subaltern approach have been focused on challenging the dominant elitist narratives. Now, subaltern historiography challenges the elitist, which is often Brahmanical, view of India's colonial history and independence movement. Instead of focusing solely on the narratives of political elites, the approach prioritizes the experiences and agency of non-elites, such as peasants, tribal communities, and marginalized castes, who have largely been overlooked in conventional history writing. And you have to remember that we are talking about historiography or the writing of history. And it is important because it creates or generates a knowledge. Now, subaltern scholars argue that traditional nationalist narratives often exclude these voices which are in the margins, thereby presenting a homogenized and universalized view of the struggle for independence. By reclaiming the experiences of the marginalized, subaltern historiography seeks to disrupt the dominance of elite perspectives and reconstruct history from the standpoint of what they call the subalterns or the people at the margins. Now, much like the Dalit historiography, subaltern historiography is also focused on reviving the narratives that are hitherto not in the dominant sphere. So, revival and reclamation, as we will see in the way in which we also create this method in the class, has been a central concern for both Dalit historiography as well as subaltern historiography. This approach challenges the authority and assumptions of elite historical narratives, emphasizing that history is not a monolithic account, but a field of contestation where power dynamics shape whose voices are heard and whose are silenced. Ranajit Guha, a foundational figure in subaltern studies, sought to what he calls de-elitize nationalist history by examining overlooked events like the Santal Rebellion of 1855. Now, what is the Santal Rebellion? So, the rebellion led by the Santal community under the command of Thakur, their local deity, was a significant but marginalized episode in colonial history. The Santal Rebellion of 1855 was a significant uprising led by the Santal tribal community against British colonial rule and oppressive local landlords of the Bengal Presidency. Sparked by the widespread exploitation, harsh taxes and loss of ancestral land, the rebellion saw the Santals under the leadership of brothers Sidhu and Kanu Murmu rise in defiance. In popular history, the rebellion has often been portrayed as a chaotic, spontaneous act of violence, lacking organized strategy or political consciousness. And you have to remember that this is an interpretation that is shaped by the colonial records and mainstream nationalist narratives. In his work, The Prose of Counter-Insurgency, which was published in 1988, Ranajit Guha critiques the way colonial authorities reduced peasant insurgencies to mere administrative concerns, stripping them of their political significance and dismissing the legitimacy. By labeling these movements as purely spontaneous, the colonial administration framed them as irrational, unorganized, and lacking in political consciousness. Guha argues that labeling the rebellion as spontaneous overlooks the Santals' own understanding of their resistance, which was rooted in their religious beliefs and collective identity. He also critiques the left interpretations, arguing that they overlooked the role of caste and religion, often treating these uprisings as prehistorical or mere precursors to organized class struggle. And herein I would like to draw your attention to the terminologies that are being used by both colonial administration as well as alternative movements such as the Left Party in the Indian context. According to Guha, both the nationalist and the Marxist views maintain a scholastic and academic historical political outlook that values only conscious, pre-planned, ideology-driven movements as genuine revolts. This rigid perspective fails to acknowledge the unique forms of agency exhibited by marginalized communities whose modes of resistance may not align with conventional frameworks of organized political action. Guha's approach is deeply influenced by Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony and the idea of subaltern consciousness. Drawing from Gramsci, Guha critiques the assumption that genuine political movements must adhere to formal, elite-driven frameworks. He emphasizes that historical narratives are inherently distorted, shaped by the biases and limitations of those who record them. Guha acknowledges that no historical account can fully capture the consciousness of the marginalized because such narratives are filtered through the perspective of the elite. In his view, I quote, "There is nothing that historiography can do to eliminate such distortion altogether, for the latter is built into its optics. What it can do, however, is to acknowledge such distortion as parametric, as a datum which determines the form of the exercise itself, and to stop pretending that it can fully grasp a past consciousness and reconstitute it." This statement reflects a critical self-awareness in the writing of history, advocating for a more nuanced approach that accepts its limitations and acknowledges the power dynamics inherent in historiography or the writing of history. The Santhal rebellion exemplifies an alternative historical narrative that defies the framework of both elitist as well as Marxist analysis. It emerges from the indigenous religious beliefs, local leadership, and spontaneous collective action that challenge the notion that legitimizes resistance and that argues that resistance must be premeditated, ideologically cohesive, or led by formal political elites. The rebellion, therefore, becomes a symbol of subaltern agency, one that disrupts dominant narratives and demands a rethinking of history from the perspective of the marginalized. By highlighting such episodes, Guha and other subaltern scholars seek to expand the scope of historical inquiry, making it more inclusive and representative of India's diverse socio-cultural realities. This subaltern perspective not only critiques the mainstream historical accounts, but also questions the very methods and frameworks through which history is written, thereby pushing for a more democratic and pluralistic understanding of the past. Elaborating on the purpose of theory writing and even history writing, Dipesh Chakraborty writes in Minority Histories and Subaltern Pasts, I quote, "The relation between subaltern pasts and the practice of historicizing is not one of mutual exclusion. Subaltern pasts act as a supplement to the historian's pasts and in fact aid our capacity to historicize. They enable history, the discipline, to be what it is and yet at the same time help to show forth what its limits are." Unquote. Subaltern studies worked within this ambit of critical inquiry into dominant elitist nationalist history and provides an alternative history. Now we can ask, who has the authority to write history and what relationship of power and knowledge is operative in such assertion or authentication? Dipesh Chakraborty in fact is quite skeptical about the minority histories as well. However, he addresses the issue of what he calls the question of crafting through the following questions. How do you write histories of the suppressed groups? How do you construct a narrative of a group or class that has not left its own resources? He also emphasizes on the denominator minor, which he understands not in numerical terms, but in the context of power position they are located in. It is important, he argues, to understand the term minority in the sense that their very incorporation into history or historical narratives converts them into pasts of lesser importance vis-a-vis dominant understandings of what constitutes fact and evidence in the practices of professional history. He argues that such ignorance or silencing is not intentional but implicit. In the context of producing or writing a subaltern history, Dipesh Chakraborty points to the dilemma or rift between the subaltern subjects of history and what the subaltern deems as the subject of their history. You have to pay attention to the two different categories I have just mentioned, the subject of history and what the subaltern deems to be the subject of history. He refers to Guha's construction of subaltern history centered on the Santal rebellion of 1855, where Chakraborty opines that Guha seems to be grappling with the actual event of the rebellion, which in professional history is often driven from the consciousness of the rebels and the cause that led the Santals to rebel. That is, the Santals' understanding of the rebellion, which in this case is caused by a supernatural belief that Thakur, their god, instructed them to rebel and promised that true believers would not be harmed by the British bullets. Now, Guha, according to Chakraborty, therefore has to negotiate between the so-called non-fact or the supernatural and the actual event of the movement. Guha thus needs to impose logic onto the subaltern consciousness in order to make it suitable for professional history. What ensues is a dissociation between the subjects or the Santal's consciousness and the consciousness of the history writer, and in this case Guha. As a result, their beliefs never get translated into our beliefs. There is a clear dissociation between the subject and the writer of the history. This makes Chakraborty question the validity of the discipline of history as an authorizer of knowledge and leads to the conclusion that history is only one way of documenting or telling a past differently. He writes, I quote, "In other words, the act of championing minority histories has resulted in many cases in discoveries of subaltern pasts, constructions of history that help us see the limits to the mode of viewing embodied in the practices of discipline of history." Why so? Because it has been argued by many, from Greg Denning to David Cohen in recent times, that the discipline of history is only one particular way of remembering the past. It is one amongst many. And herein the narratives, memoir, etc. become important in creating another past. To summarize, subaltern historiography is an approach to writing history that focuses on the perspectives, experiences and agency of the marginalized and the oppressed groups, those who have been historically excluded from the mainstream, elite-centered and Brahminical narratives. Emerging in the 1980s largely through the work of Subaltern Studies Group led by Ranajit Guha, it critiques the dominance of colonial, nationalist as well as Marxist interpretations that often ignore the voices of the subalterns, such as peasants, tribal communities and lower castes. Subaltern historiography aims to challenge elitist narratives and reconstruct history from the viewpoint of the oppressed, emphasizing that resistance and consciousness exist even outside formal organized political movements. By questioning the authority of established historical writing, it seeks to democratize history and reveal the limitations of conventional historiography. Thank you.